Welcome everyone. Today's mini lesson is going to focus on the concertos of Mozart, in particular the piano concertos. And even though we've been talking about Mozart in other contexts, any discussion of this composer must take into account one of his most important genres, which is the genre of the concerto. We have evidence that Mozart began showing interest in composing concerto-like works when he was about 4 or 5 years old, which is really pretty unbelievable. And so when he moved from his native Salzburg to Vienna in 1781, he needed to find a way to make money, obviously. And he felt that one of the best ways to bring more income, aside from teaching and composition, was to feature himself as a soloist in his own concerto. Since Mozart was a very gifted keyboard player, it makes sense that a lot of his greatest contributions to the concerto would be for the keyboard. I have here a little outline of some of the things we're going to talk about related to Mozart's piano concertos. Hope you can all see that. I just want to highlight a few things, and then we're going to talk about an example of one of his most famous concertos, which is the piano concerto in A major from 1786. As often was the case with Mozart during his travels as a young boy, he was able to visit many different places and be influenced by the composers and the musical styles that he heard there. And so on one of his trips to London, Mozart was able to make the acquaintance of J.S. Bach's youngest son, Johann Christian Bach. And Bach, who was sometimes known as the London Bach, was especially known for his instrumental music and his concertos in particular. These concertos that Mozart heard, and he also had the opportunity to meet J.C. Bach. These concertos had a big influence on Mozart, especially the beautiful lyrical quality of the writing for the soloist and the structure, which would later become known as double exposition form, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Mozart's concertos follow the example that we've talked about in previous concertos going back to the time of Vivaldi. And they are a three-movement fast, slow, fast design, so opening movement, fast tempo. Second movement in a closely related key, usually the subdominant, and a fast finale, often in rondo or sonata rondo form. And this is true not only for the piano concertos, but also for the many other wonderful concertos that Mozart wrote that we don't have time to talk about. But the horn concertos, the very famous clarinet concerto, one of his last pieces, the concertos for oboe and flute, etc., the five violin concertos, all of them basically follow this general model. As far as piano concertos are concerned, Mozart wrote 17 original piano concertos during his Vienna period, so the last decade of his life. And the standard numbering for Mozart's concertos is closer to 27, which takes into account several arrangements that he made of concertos by other composers, and also some of them that feature more than one solo part. But in the Vienna period, those 17 are the ones that are to this day the best known of Mozart's keyboard concertos. Mozart's concertos, I like to describe them as having a very unique structure, especially in the first movement. It's sort of like Ritornello meets sonata form. So the idea of using the old Ritornello form with an alternation between the soloist and the orchestra is not something that was unique. We see it in the concertos of Bach, of course, in the concertos of Vivaldi. But what was a bit unique is the interplay that you find in Mozart's concertos between the solo instrument, or instruments in a few cases, and the orchestra. It's really, he structures concertos much more like chamber music, so there are lots of opportunities for back and forth between the parts, and this, relates to the fact that Mozart himself was the soloist at the early performances of many of these pieces. He would conduct from the keyboard, and so he wanted to have that kind of interaction between the entire ensemble. Where I say Ritornello meets sonata form is related to what I have up here in this next bullet. The way that Mozart structures the opening movements of his concertos is sometimes referred to as double exposition form. So rather than in a symphony where you'll have a single exposition, there'll actually be two expositions, one for the orchestra and one for the soloist. The orchestral exposition will typically not modulate, which is different than what we've talked about in expositions in symphonies or sonatas. it will stay in the tonic key. But it will have many of the same other things that we see in an exposition. It'll have an opening theme, a transition, a second theme perhaps, a closing theme. And then the second exposition is often referred to as the solo exposition, where the composer will modulate. So we'll move to the relative major of the pieces in a minor key, or more commonly, we'll move to the dominant, which is what we would expect in traditional sonata form in a symphony or a sonata. The solo exposition also allows the performer to do more improvisation, and sometimes, as is the case of the concerto we're going to listen to add some additional thematic material that was not present in the initial opening orchestral exposition. We're going to talk about the Concerto K488 in A major. And this concerto was written in 1786, which was a time of extraordinary productivity for the composers, the same year in which he wrote Marriage of Figaro and many other important works, where he was keeping a tremendous compositional schedule. It's a very beautiful concerto, very lyrical in style, very operatic. It's often been described as having elements of opera buffa, and I think that you'll hear some of that in the music. So the structure of it overall is you'll have the opening orchestral exposition, which I'm going to play a little bit of, and then you'll have the entrance of the soloist for their exposition. The rest of the movement alternates between sections featuring the soloist and sections featuring the orchestra, but can be organized using the terminology of sonata form. So you think of the opening orchestra and solo as the exposition, if you will, divided into the two for the soloist, for the orchestra, and followed by the soloist. Then you have a development section where Mozart is going to explore several different keys and use some of the themes that he's presented previously in the movement in various keys. And then you're going to have a recapitulation with the music from the beginning. But at the conclusion, there is, as we would expect in any concerto, there's going to be a chance for the soloist to show off a bit. So the cadenza. We only have a few surviving cadenzas in Mozart's hand. We can assume that most of the time he would improvise his cadenzas, but this provided an opportunity for the orchestra to take a bit of a break so that the soloist can really do a free improvisation. Usually cadenza sections will be based on musical material that's been heard before. We see that in some of Mozart's own surviving cadenzas, but the soloist can really do pretty much whatever they want. At the conclusion of the cadenza, then the orchestra will return for the final ritornello, or the final section of the concerto, to close it off. So I'd like for us to listen to a couple of short excerpts from K488, first movement, and of course I would encourage you to, right after this video, to go and listen to the entire recording, either on Spotify or on any other medium that you would like. So here is the opening of Mozart's Concerto for Piano K488. So this is the first theme. Transition. Second theme, but in the tonic. All right, moving forward just a bit, here is just a little bit of the first entrance of the solo. So this would be the beginning of the solo exposition. So here it's the same theme. All right, so that gives you a little bit of an idea. When you go back and listen to it again, notice how often thematic material is shifted between the pianist and the orchestra. And this is a fairly rich orchestration that Mozart's using with a full wind group. We have flutes, clarinets, bassoons, and horns in addition to the strings. Now moving forward just a little bit to the beginning of the cadenza. Cadenzas are almost always preceded by a big 6/4 chord, tonic 6/4 chord, and you'll hear that in this excerpt. So cadential 6/4, cadenza. Okay, and then the conclusion of the cadenza leading into the final statement from the orchestra. Very opera bouffe-like at the end of that movement. Just a few short thoughts about the remaining movements of the concerto before we close. So the second movement is in F sharp minor. It's structured very much in a large ABA form and is very much like an aria, song without words, if you will. And Mozart often liked to do that, make it slow movements, have an operatic quality. It's also written in the key of F sharp minor, which was an exceedingly rare key in the 18th century. As a matter of fact, this is the only movement by Mozart in a large-scale instrumental piece in that key. And then the third movement is a wonderful sonata rondo conclusion, goes back, of course, to the tonic, and represents the kind of lighthearted quality that Mozart would often use in the finales of his concertos. These concertos served many different functions for the composer, both to show his ability in composition, but also his ability as a performer, and to provide an opportunity for him to hopefully get additional commissions, and that happened quite a bit, especially in his early years in Vienna. Mozart wanted these pieces to be works that were immediately accessible. And so some of the more difficult contrapuntal sort of writing he tended to reserve for other genres. But I wanted to close by reading a short excerpt from a famous letter that Mozart wrote to his father in 1782, talking about his goal for the concertos that he wrote. I wanted to, quote, strike a happy medium between what is too easy and too difficult, very brilliant, pleasing to the ear, and natural. There are passages here and there from which connoisseurs alone may derive satisfaction, but these passages are written in such a way that the less educated cannot fail to be pleased, though without knowing why. So that concludes today's short introduction to Mozart and the Concerto. We'll see you next time. Thank you, stay safe, wash your hands.